job, my reputation, maybe even my sense of dignity. Yet here he was, the CEO of the entire company, leaning forward with an expression that was unreadable, his voice calm, but carrying a spark that felt almost dangerous. I blinked at him, unsure if I had heard him correctly. My mind immediately scrambled to fill in the blanks. What did he mean? The beginning? The beginning of what? A lecture? A punishment drawn out instead of swift? Or was this some kind of game, a way to toy with me before delivering the inevitable blow? "I don't understand, sir," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. His lips curled into the faintest smile, but his eyes remained sharp. "You've shown something tonight that most people don't," he said. "You didn't bend. You didn't crumble. You followed your principles even when you thought it would cost you everything. That kind of resolve is rare, and I value it more than you know." I stared at him, my heart thudding in my chest. My disbelief warred with a flicker of hope that threatened to rise. "Are you saying—" I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. He leaned back against the desk, crossing his arms as though weighing me. "I'm saying I want you to work with me, directly. Not as a guard, not in the shadows, but inside the rooms where decisions are made. I want to see what else you're capable of when the stakes are even higher." The words hit me with the force of a tidal wave. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. Me? Work directly under him? The same man who only minutes ago I had stopped at the door? My chest tightened as disbelief and fear tangled with something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Hope. Behind me, I heard one of my colleagues choke back a laugh. Another muttered under his breath, too low for the CEO to hear, but loud enough for me. "No way. This can't be real." Their shock mirrored my own, but the mocking undertones reminded me of where I stood in their eyes. An ordinary guard, nothing more. The receptionist, however, looked at me differently. Her eyes were wide, her lips slightly parted in astonishment, as though she too couldn't believe what was happening. The air in the room shifted. Gossip was already brewing, and by morning, the story would spread through every floor of the company, the guard who stopped the CEO, and the insane twist that followed. My pulse quickened. A storm of thoughts whirled inside me. If I accepted, what would happen? Could I even handle it? I had no degree, no polished background, no experience in the kind of work he was talking about. My whole life, I had been standing on the periphery, watching people like him stride past while I remained invisible. How could I suddenly step into his world as anything but an imposter? But then another thought struck me, burning hotter than the fear. What if this was the chance I had been waiting for all my life? What if every sleepless night, every humiliation, every moment I had, felt trapped, was leading to this? Opportunities like this didn't just appear. They had to be seized, no matter the cost. "Why me?" I asked, my voice unsteady, betraying the chaos inside me. His smirk deepened just slightly. "Because I see myself in you," he replied. "I started with nothing. People doubted me, laughed at me, dismissed me. But I knew that if I didn't take the chances when they came, I'd be stuck forever. You're at that crossroads now. The difference between who you are and who you could become is one decision." The weight of his words pressed against me, suffocating yet liberating. He wasn't offering me just a job. He was offering me a door to a world I had never known, a world I had only glimpsed in the dreams I buried each night. And yet, stepping through that door meant leaving behind the fragile security of the life I knew. I thought about my parents, their tired eyes, their endless sacrifices. I thought about the boy I used to be, standing in a school hallway, invisible among peers who had brighter futures. I thought about all the nights I had stared at the ceiling, wondering if life had more to offer than this endless monotony. And now, here it was, life offering me an answer I hadn't dared to imagine. My fear screamed at me. What if I failed? What if I accepted and proved myself unworthy? What if I embarrassed myself in front of the very man who had put his trust in me? Failure in my current role would mean losing a job. Failure in the role he offered could mean losing the last shred of confidence I had left. But hope whispered louder. What if I succeeded? What if I rose higher than I ever thought possible? What if this was my chance to finally matter, to finally break free from the shadows and prove to myself, and everyone else, that I was more than a uniform? I realized then that my decision would define the rest of my life. Accepting his offer meant risking everything, but it also meant stepping into the possibility of everything I had ever wanted. Rejecting it meant safety, predictability, but also the certainty that I would remain exactly where I was, guarding doors, invisible, forgotten. The room was silent, every eye on me, waiting. My colleagues' smirks, the receptionist's disbelief, the CEO's calm intensity, all of it swirled around me, but at the center was only my pounding heart and the question that loomed larger than anything else. And as his gaze held mine, sharp and unwavering, I understood. This was no ordinary choice. This was the line between the life I had lived and the life I could create. Accepting meant stepping into a world I had never known before. From guarding doors to sitting in the CEO's office, it felt unreal. One moment, I was standing in the lobby in a cheap uniform, clipboard clutched to my chest, invisible to the very people I was paid to protect. The next, I was stepping into a world of glass walls, polished marble floors, and towering windows that looked out over the city like a throne above the kingdom. It was as though I had crossed a threshold into another universe, one that was never meant for people like me. My first days under his mentorship were a whirlwind, each one testing me in ways I had never imagined. The CEO, Mr. Harrison, didn't waste time with pleasantries. On the very first morning, he handed me a stack of documents thicker than my arm and told me to read them. "Understand them," he said simply, his tone sharp but not unkind. "If you can't, then you don't belong here." The words stung, but they also lit a fire inside me. I spent hours poring over those documents, my eyes burning from the endless text, my mind spinning with terms and concepts I had never heard before. Budgets, projections, contracts. It was like learning a foreign language overnight. My stomach twisted with doubt, but every time I wanted to quit, I remembered the lobby, remembered the night he had seen something in me worth testing. If I failed now, it would prove everyone else right, that I was nothing more than a guard who got lucky. The challenges came daily, relentless and unforgiving. He made me sit in on meetings where executives spoke in polished jargon, their sentences layered with numbers and strategies that soared over my head. At first I sat stiffly in the corner, silent and small, praying no one would notice me. But Harrison made sure they did. "What do you think?" he would ask suddenly, turning the room's attention to me. My heart would pound, my palms would sweat, and all eyes would land on me like spotlights. I stumbled, fumbled, stammered, but slowly, painfully, I began to find my voice. Harrison was tough, tougher than anyone I had ever met. He didn't tolerate excuses. When I made a mistake, he pointed it out bluntly, without sugarcoating. "Sloppy," he would say, his tone cutting. "You didn't think this through. Do it again." His words sometimes left me burning with humiliation, but they also forced me to sharpen myself. Every correction became a lesson, every harsh word a challenge to rise higher. And yet, beneath the sharpness, there was guidance. He never discarded me, never told me I didn't belong. Instead, he pushed me again and again, testing the limits of what I could endure. "If you want to grow," he told me once, his voice softer than usual, "you have to be uncomfortable. Comfort is the enemy of change." Those words echoed in my mind long after he said them, becoming a mantra I clung to whenever the pressure felt unbearable. Respect between us began to grow in unexpected ways. I respected his brilliance, his relentless drive, his refusal to let me settle for less than my best. And though he rarely said it outright, I sensed his respect for me, too, for my stubborn persistence, for my refusal to crumble even when I stumbled. One evening, after a grueling day of reviewing contracts, he caught me still sitting at my desk long after everyone else had gone home. He paused at the doorway, watching me scribble notes with tired eyes. For a moment, I thought he might scold me for overworking, but instead he nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement that meant more than words. The office itself became both my battlefield and my classroom. I learned to navigate the unspoken politics of boardrooms, to read the subtle cues in people's expressions, to speak not just with words, but with confidence. At first, my colleagues eyed me with suspicion, whispering behind my back, questioning why the CEO had brought a security guard into their world. Their judgment cut deep. But every day I stayed, every day I worked harder than they expected, I chipped away at their doubts. There were nights I went home exhausted, collapsing onto my bed with my mind still racing, my body aching from the tension of holding myself together. I questioned myself constantly. Was I good enough? Could I ever truly belong in this world? But then I would remember Harrison's sharp eyes, the way he had seen something in me that night when no one else had. That belief, however small, became the anchor that kept me from drowning. Weeks turned into months, and slowly I began to transform. The jargon that once felt like a foreign language began to make sense. The fear that once silenced me in meetings began to fade, replaced by a cautious confidence. I started to see patterns, to connect dots, to contribute in ways that surprised even me. And each time I did, I caught a glimmer of pride in Harrison's expression, fleeting but undeniable. He was not an easy mentor, but he was a fair one. He demanded everything from me, and in return, he gave me the chance to prove myself. Our conversations grew less like teacher and student, and more like strategist and apprentice. Sometimes, late at night when the office was empty, he would share pieces of his past, the failures that nearly broke him, the nights he spent wondering if he would ever rise. In those moments, I saw not just the CEO, but the man who had once stood where I stood, fighting the same invisible battles. And then came the day everything shifted again. It started like any other morning. I arrived early, carrying a stack of notes I had worked on through the night. Harrison was already in his office, his sharp eyes scanning a file as though the world outside didn't exist. He barely looked up as I entered, but then he slid a folder across the desk toward me. "Read this," he said simply. I opened it, my eyes scanning the pages. My heart began to race as I realized what I was holding. A major proposal, one that would determine the future of a project worth millions. My mouth went dry. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just paperwork. This was a decision that could change everything for the company. When I looked up, his gaze was steady, unreadable. "I want your recommendation by tomorrow," he said. Shock rippled through me. Tomorrow? Me? My mind screamed that I wasn't ready, that I wasn't qualified, that I would surely fail. Yet his expression didn't waver. He wasn't giving me an option. He was giving me a test. Then came the day he put me to the ultimate test. He handed me a decision that could make or break the company. It wasn't a stack of files to read or a list of numbers to check. It was a living, breathing problem, messy and uncertain, with real consequences and risks that stretched far beyond anything I had ever faced. As I stared at the folder on his desk, my chest tightened and my palms grew clammy. For the first time, I understood just how much weight leadership carried. And for the first time, I wondered if I could possibly bear it. The folder contained details of a potential investment deal, one that could either bring millions in profit or drag the company into a financial storm it might never escape. The executives had been circling around it for weeks, unable to agree on a direction. Some saw opportunity, others smelled disaster, but no one had been able to convince Harrison. Now he had placed it in my hands. "I want your recommendation," he said, his tone calm, but his eyes sharp. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. The word echoed in my mind like a death sentence. How could I, a man who had been guarding doors only months ago, possibly analyze and decide on something that seasoned executives were still arguing over? My throat went dry, and my first instinct was to protest. But his gaze told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a request. This was a test, and the kind that would define my place in his world. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my small desk in my modest apartment, the pages of the proposal spread out in front of me like pieces of an unsolvable puzzle. Numbers blurred together, words twisted in my mind, and with every passing hour, the weight on my shoulders grew heavier. Doubt clawed at me. Who was I to think I could make this decision? Who was I to believe my judgment could matter in a company that employed people with degrees, experience, and polished resumes? But beneath the fear was determination. I remembered the first night I stopped him at the door, the stubbornness that had refused to let me step aside. I remembered the hours I had spent studying documents I didn't understand until the words finally began to make sense. I remembered his voice telling me that hunger was what separated those who rose from those who stayed behind. And I realized this was my fire. Either I would burn in it, or I would be forged by it. I read until my eyes ached, until the letters swam on the page, until the city outside my window faded from night to dawn. I scribbled notes in the margins, drew arrows, questioned assumptions. I thought about the numbers, yes, but also about the people behind them. The employees whose jobs could be at risk, the clients whose trust could be broken, the future that could be shaped or destroyed by a single decision. Slowly, piece by piece, the fog began to lift. By the time the sun rose, I had something resembling clarity. My body trembled from exhaustion, but my mind had found a thread of certainty amid the chaos. It wasn't about what the numbers said alone. It was about what they didn't say. It was about vision, about risk balanced with responsibility, about the courage to step into the unknown with eyes wide open. The next morning, I walked into the building with dark circles under my eyes, but a strange fire in my chest. My colleagues noticed immediately. I heard their whispers trail behind me as I entered the conference room where the executives were already gathered. Is he really going to present something? A guard making investment decisions? This is insane! Their disbelief was palpable, their doubt sharp enough to cut. Some looked at me with open mockery, smirks curling their lips as though I was about to embarrass myself in front of the entire leadership team. Others shook their heads, pity in their eyes, convinced I had been set up to fail. But Harrison sat at the head of the table, calm and composed, his expression unreadable. His presence anchored me as I took my seat at the far end, clutching the folder like a lifeline. When the room fell silent, he spoke. "You've all had your say. Now, let's hear his." Every eye turned to me. My throat tightened, and for a moment I felt the old panic clawing at me. But then I remembered the hours I had spent tearing through those pages, the way my mind had sharpened with every sleepless night, the fire that had kept me going when exhaustion threatened to consume me. I drew in a slow breath, steadied myself, and began to speak. I walked them through my analysis, not with the polish of an executive, but with the raw clarity of someone who had stared at the problem until it revealed itself. I pointed out the risks, not sugarcoating them, and highlighted the opportunities, not exaggerating them. I explained what I saw, not just in the numbers, but in the patterns, in the potential, in the long-term vision that seemed to hide beneath the surface. At first, the room was restless. I heard sighs, saw raised eyebrows, caught smirks exchanged between colleagues. But as I continued, the atmosphere shifted. Their expressions sharpened, their posture straightened, their whispers stilled. Doubt gave way to curiosity, and curiosity to silence. By the time I reached my conclusion, the room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the lights above us. My chest heaved, My palms were damp, but my voice remained steady as I delivered my final recommendation. And then it was done. I lowered the folder, met their eyes, and waited. The silence that followed was suffocating. Some looked stunned, others skeptical, but none spoke. My heart pounded in my chest as the weight of their judgment pressed down on me. Then I looked at Harrison. He sat there, his fingers steepled, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. For a long moment, he said nothing, and I thought I had failed, that my words had been meaningless, that my effort had been wasted, that I was about to be dismissed from the room and from his world. But instead, I saw something flicker in his eyes, something sharp, something almost dangerous. It wasn't anger, it wasn't disappointment, it was surprise. My answer shocked everyone in the boardroom. The same people who once looked down on me now stood in awe. The boardroom, which had felt like a hostile battlefield when I first walked in, was suddenly silent in a way I had never experienced before. Moments earlier, I had been nothing more than the former guard trying to speak in a room full of executives, their skepticism heavy enough to crush me. But now, after delivering my recommendation, their silence carried a different weight. They weren't dismissing me anymore. They were waiting for Harrison, the man at the head of the table, to speak. He leaned back in his chair, fingers still steepled, his gaze steady on me. My chest tightened, every nerve in my body alive, because I knew that whatever he said next would decide whether I had just made a fool of myself or carved a place in this world that had once been closed to me. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, scanned the faces around the table before returning to mine. And then, with a voice calm but unmistakably firm, he said, "Well done." 2 simple words, yet they struck harder than any applause could have. A ripple moved through the room, executives shifting in their chairs, eyebrows lifting, jaws tightening. Some tried to hide their surprise, others couldn't. For years, these were people who had built careers, climbed ladders, polished their skills, and here was I, a man who had once guarded doors, receiving praise from the one man whose approval mattered most. I could feel the shock radiating from them. One executive cleared his throat as if to protest, but stopped when Harrison's gaze swept in his direction. Another looked down at her papers, her lips pressed tightly together, unable to mask her discomfort. And yet, there were others whose eyes had softened, their doubt replaced by something that looked almost like respect. Inside me, something shifted. For so long, I had walked these halls unseen, a shadow in uniform, my presence unnoticed. But in that moment, under the weight of Harrison's words, I felt visible in a way I had never been before. My heart swelled with a quiet pride, not loud or boastful, but steady, rooted deep inside me. I realized I had done something no one expected, not even me. Harrison's expression remained calm, but I caught the faintest flicker of a smile, small and subtle, but real. It wasn't the kind of smile meant for show. It was the kind of smile that carried acknowledgement, recognition, maybe even approval. And in that fleeting curve of his lips, I saw something more than victory. I saw validation. From that day forward, the way people looked at me changed. In the halls, executives who once passed me without a glance now nodded, sometimes even stopping to exchange a few words. Their tone was still cautious, but it carried an undercurrent of respect I had never felt before. My colleagues, the ones who had whispered behind my back, mocking the idea that I could ever belong, suddenly grew quiet in my presence. Some avoided eye contact, others tried to mask their earlier disdain with forced politeness. I didn't need their apologies. Their silence was apology enough. The receptionist, who had watched everything unfold that night in the lobby, smiled when she saw me, her expression proud, as if she too had witnessed a transformation that nobody else could fully understand. Word had spread quickly through the building. People whispered about the guard who impressed the CEO, and though some spoke with disbelief, others with envy, I knew the truth. I had stepped out of invisibility. Inside, I felt a strange balance between pride and humility. Pride that I had stood my ground, pride that my voice had mattered in a place where I had once been voiceless. But humility, too, because I knew how fragile it all was. One wrong move, one careless mistake, and I could tumble back into the shadows. That awareness kept me grounded, reminding me that respect wasn't a gift. It was something to be earned again and again. Harrison, true to his nature, didn't linger on the praise. He didn't shower me with compliments, didn't coddle me. Instead, after acknowledging my recommendation, he simply said, "Now let's see if you can keep it up." His words were both challenge and warning, a reminder that a single success wasn't enough. He expected more, always more. And strangely, that didn't terrify me. It motivated me. The days that followed were grueling, but different. Before, I had felt like an outsider struggling to catch up. Now, I felt like someone with a place to fight for. I studied harder, worked longer, asked questions I once would have been too embarrassed to ask. I wanted to prove, to Harrison, to the others, and to myself, that my success in that boardroom wasn't luck. It was the beginning of something greater. Harrison's quiet smile lingered in my memory, replaying in moments of doubt like a spark reminding me why I couldn't give up. He never spoke of it again, but I knew it had been real, and that silent acknowledgement became my fuel, driving me through sleepless nights and endless challenges. Still, I knew him well enough now to understand that he was far from done with me. For every test I passed, he would create another. For every step I climbed, he would raise the bar higher. He wasn't just teaching me business, he was teaching me resilience, adaptability, strength. And then, just when I thought I had finally begun to find steady ground, he called me into his office one morning. His face was calm, his tone even. But there was something in his eyes that told me this would not be like the other challenges he had given me. But he wasn't done teaching me yet. I never thought I'd lead the very people who once mocked me. The irony of it often struck me during those early mornings, when I walked through the halls in a suit instead of a uniform, carrying files instead of a flashlight, heading to meetings instead of security rounds. Not long ago, I was invisible to these people, the one they laughed about when I insisted on rules, the one they whispered about when I stood my ground. Now their laughter had quieted, replaced by polite greetings, nods of acknowledgement, and in some cases, genuine respect. My rise into a leadership role was not sudden, though it often felt like a blur. Harrison didn't hand me authority wrapped in a ribbon. He made me earn it, inch by inch, day by day. First, he gave me projects to oversee. Small ones at first, where the risks were manageable. I stumbled, sometimes badly, and there were days when I went home feeling like I had no business being there. But each time I stumbled, he dissected my mistakes with surgical precision. Not to shame me, but to make me stronger. "You're thinking too small," he told me once after I failed to consider the bigger impact of a decision. Leaders don't just react to problems, they anticipate them. If you want to sit at the table, you have to learn to see the whole board. His words stung, but they also lit a fire in me. I began forcing myself to look beyond the obvious, to think not just about today's outcomes, but tomorrow's consequences. The struggles of adapting were relentless. I wasn't used to having people report to me, to being the one expected to make calls that affected others' work. Some employees resisted me at first, still seeing the guard I had once been. Their eyes carried doubt, their tone carried subtle condescension, and their whispers carried the weight of my past. But I didn't let it break me. I worked harder, listened more, and when necessary, I stood firm. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to see me not as the man who once checked IDs at the door, but as someone capable of guiding them forward. Harrison's mentorship shaped me further than I ever thought possible. He wasn't gentle, but he was intentional. He gave me challenges designed not just to test my knowledge, but to test my character. When I grew frustrated, he reminded me that growth never came from comfort. When I doubted myself, he reminded me of the hunger that had carried me this far. "You've been underestimated your whole life," he said once, his voice steady. "Good. Let them underestimate you. It makes it that much easier to prove them wrong." And he was right. The more people doubted me, the more determined I became. Their disbelief was fuel. I poured myself into every task, refusing to let their whispers define me. Slowly, something remarkable began to happen. The same people who once dismissed me began coming to me for guidance. A junior manager once cornered me after a meeting, asking for advice on handling a difficult client. I gave him my perspective, unsure if it would help. Weeks later, he returned, grateful, telling me it worked better than he expected. That moment left me stunned. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just learning. I was leading. The contrast between who I had been and who I was becoming often left me breathless. I remembered the long nights standing guard in the empty lobby, the humiliation of colleagues whispering behind my back, the crushing fear of losing everything the night I stopped Harrison at the gate. And now, here I was, sitting at the very tables I once thought were out of reach, making real decisions that shaped the direction of the company. The memory of my past kept me grounded. No matter how high I climbed, I never forgot where I started. I carried that humility with me into every interaction. When I spoke to employees, I remembered what it felt like to be unseen, unheard. I listened to them in ways others often didn't. I noticed the janitor who worked late, the receptionist who kept things running smoothly, the interns who carried quiet determination in their eyes. I saw them because I had been them. And in seeing them, I began to build something stronger than authority. I built trust. But even as I began to find my footing, Harrison kept pushing. He reminded me that leadership was never about arriving. It was about evolving. The moment you think you've made it, he warned, is the moment you start to fall. His lessons were sharp, his standards uncompromising, but beneath it all was a strange kind of faith in me. He believed I could handle it, and that belief became the foundation of my growth. The shift in how people saw me was undeniable. In meetings, when I spoke, people listened. In hallways, when I passed, people acknowledged me. Even those who once mocked me began to soften, their skepticism replaced by respect, grudging at first, but real. And though part of me wanted to gloat, to throw their past words back at them, I resisted. My victory wasn't in proving them wrong with words. It was in proving myself right with actions. And yet I knew this wasn't the end. Leadership was not a final destination, but a constant test, one that Harrison was always ready to raise higher. He had given me the chance to rise, but he wasn't the type to let me grow comfortable. I sensed it every time I caught that quiet glimmer in his eyes, the look of a man already planning the next challenge. That challenge came sooner than I expected. One morning, I walked into the office to find a tension in the air. People gathered in small groups, whispering, their faces pale with speculation. I stepped into the conference room, and Harrison was already there, his expression unreadable, his hands folded calmly on the table. As I took my seat, he looked at me with that same sharp gaze I had come to know so well. And then he spoke words that sent a ripple of shock through the entire room. Words that would change not only my path, but the company's future. And then came the announcement that stunned the entire company. Sometimes one mistake reveals your true destiny. I thought that night in the lobby, when I stopped a man I didn't recognize, would be the end of me. I thought I had made the kind of mistake that crushes a career, ruins a reputation, and follows you for the rest of your life. Yet it turned out to be the moment that unlocked a future I had never dared to dream of. Looking back now, I realized that the very thing I feared the most, that confrontation, that humiliation, that split-second decision, was the beginning of everything. The journey from humiliation to growth was not smooth. In those early days, I carried the sting of embarrassment like a scar. I replayed the moment over and over, the whispers of my colleagues mocking me, the weight of my fear pressing on my chest. But what I didn't realize at the time was that Harrison, our CEO, had seen something more than a mistake. He had seen character. Where others saw foolishness, he saw resolve. Where others saw stubbornness, he saw integrity. His belief in me, however small, became the turning point of my life. It wasn't easy. Growth never is. Every step forward came with new challenges, new doubts, new obstacles designed to test me. But through it all, one truth became clear. Integrity and duty are never wasted. The decision to stand my ground that night, to follow the rules even when it seemed foolish, was not the wrong choice. It was the right one, even if I didn't understand it in the moment. That integrity became my foundation. It was what carried me from the lobby into the boardroom, from invisibility into recognition, from a man who guarded doors to a man who now helped open them. I learned that leadership isn't about power or titles. It's about responsibility. It's about showing up when it's easier to step aside. It's about doing what's right even when it costs you comfort, even when it risks your pride. Harrison taught me that lesson over and over, not with kindness, but with challenges that forced me to grow. And in those challenges, I discovered something I had never truly believed before, that I was capable of more than survival. I was capable of becoming someone who mattered. When I look back at the man I was, the guard standing nervously in a uniform too big for him, clutching a clipboard like it was a shield, I don't see weakness anymore. I see the seed of who I would become. I see the hunger that would drive me forward, the stubbornness that would keep me standing, the integrity that would guide me when everything else was uncertain. I see the very qualities Harrison saw in me that night, the ones I didn't recognize in myself until much later. To anyone listening to my story, I want to leave you with this. Rejection, humiliation, mistakes, they are not the end. They are often the beginning. The doors that seem closed may only be redirecting you to the ones that will truly change your life. Every sleepless night, every doubt, every whisper of, "You're not good enough," can be fuel if you let it. Pain can be power. Struggle can be strength. Integrity can be destiny. And if you ever find yourself standing at a door, unsure whether to act, unsure whether doing the right thing is worth the cost, remember this. You never know who is watching. You never know how one choice, one moment of courage, might reshape your future. My story is not about luck. It's about holding on to principles when it seemed pointless, about refusing to crumble under pressure, about trusting that doing the right thing is never wasted. That night, I thought I had ruined everything. Instead, I discovered the path to everything I had ever wanted. Because sometimes, the truth you fear the most is the one that saves you. If this story inspired you, don't let it stop here. There are so many more journeys waiting to be told. Tap the like button if you enjoyed it, drop your thoughts in the comments below, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder to never give up. And if you want to hear more powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one. I never imagined one routine shift would turn my entire life upside down. For me, work was not about glory or excitement. It was about survival. Being a security guard was never the dream I had as a child, but it was the only job I could hold on to after life had stripped away every other option. When I put on that cheap navy blue uniform, with its loose stitches and the company logo fading from the chest pocket, I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel respected. I felt invisible. And yet, that invisibility became the canvas on which fate decided to paint the most important night of my life. I was born into modest means, raised in a family where the word enough was always just out of reach. We weren't destitute, but we were constantly balancing on the thin line between making it through the month and falling apart. My father worked as a mechanic, his hands always stained with grease, his back bent from long hours. My mother cleaned houses for people who never remembered her name, her face always tired, but her spirit quietly resilient. Watching them struggle taught me one thing. Life doesn't hand you opportunities. You wrestle them out of the dark with your bare hands. Still, no matter how hard I tried, it seemed like life kept pushing me back into the same shadows. I never had the luxury of a college degree. While some of my friends went off to universities, posting pictures of dorm rooms and parties, I was already working full shifts to help keep food on our table. At first, I tried to chase other jobs, sales, retail, delivery, but none lasted. Eventually, I landed in security. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady. My parents sighed in relief when I got it, though I could see the flicker of disappointment in their eyes. They wanted more for me, and deep inside, I wanted more for myself, too. But wanting and having were two very different things. The life of a security guard is not glamorous. Most people walk past you without even noticing you exist. You become a fixture, like the walls or the elevators you stand beside. My shifts were long and monotonous, often stretching through the quiet hours of the night when the world outside was alive with freedom. But inside I was bound to silence and routine. I patrolled empty hallways, checked doors, watched camera screens flicker in grainy black and white. Sometimes hours passed without seeing another soul. It was in those hours that my mind drifted to dreams I dared not say aloud. I imagined what it would be like to walk into a building not in uniform, but in a suit. To sit at a table where decisions were made instead of guarding the doors that others walked through. To be respected, not ignored. I thought about the life I could build if only I had the chance. A life where money wasn't counted down to the last dollar, where exhaustion wasn't the permanent weight on my shoulders, where my parents could finally rest without worrying about bills. But those dreams felt like stars, visible, beautiful, yet impossibly far away. Each time I let myself reach for them, reality dragged me back down with the heaviness of my circumstances. Still, I endured. Night after night, I showed up. I adjusted my cap, tightened my belt, and walked my rounds. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the cameras whirred faintly, and the silence was broken only by the echo of my own footsteps. Some nights I distracted myself by scribbling notes of business ideas in a small pocket notebook I carried, though most of those ideas never went further than ink on paper. Other nights I simply leaned against the cold walls and told myself that one day, somehow, things had to change. What made that particular shift stand out at first was nothing. It began like all the others. I clocked in, nodded to the tired receptionist, and made my way to the lobby desk. The building itself was one of those modern corporate towers, all glass and steel, the kind of place where important people walked fast and spoke loudly on phones while men like me held the doors open for them. By nightfall, the energy died down. Employees filed out, lights dimmed, and silence reclaimed the hallways. For most guards, nights like that were a blessing. Quiet, easy hours. For me, they were both comfort and curse. Hours passed. I made my usual rounds, checked doors, logged entries in the report book. The lobby was empty, the hum of the vending machine filling the silence. I poured myself coffee from the stale pot in the break room, its bitterness coating my throat, and stared at the blinking lights on the security monitor. Everything was ordinary. Everything was routine. And then, just after midnight, the front doors opened. At first I thought it was a mistake, some cleaning crew arriving late or a lost delivery driver. But the man who walked in didn't carry supplies or boxes. He wore plain clothes, simple jeans, and a jacket that seemed too casual for the kind of building he was entering. His hair was neat but unremarkable, his steps purposeful but oddly restrained, as if he was trying not to draw attention. Still, something about him felt out of place. I straightened from behind the desk, narrowing my eyes as he walked closer. He didn't carry a badge, didn't nod politely the way most late visitors did. Instead, he moved with a quiet confidence, as though he belonged. Yet everything in me screamed that he didn't. "Excuse me, sir," I said, stepping in front of him, blocking his path. My voice was steady, but my heart thudded against my ribs. "The building's closed for the night. Can I see some identification?" He stopped, his eyes locking on mine, sharp and piercing in a way that made my stomach twist. There was no hesitation, no fear, no nervous fumbling. He just looked at me, calm, almost amused. And in that moment, I realized this was no ordinary visitor. I didn't know then that stopping him would change everything. Something about him felt wrong from the very first glance. It wasn't just the way he carried himself, though that was part of it. It was the entire air around him, a quiet confidence hidden beneath ordinary clothes, as though he belonged everywhere and nowhere at the same time. He stepped through the glass doors with an ease that didn't match his plain appearance, and while most people might not have noticed, my instincts screamed that this man was not what he appeared to be. Years of standing guard at those doors had sharpened me. I could usually tell the difference between someone who belonged and someone who didn't. And in that instant, I felt it in my bones that something was off. He wore simple jeans, slightly faded but clean, a dark jacket zipped halfway, and a pair of sneakers that looked too ordinary for this building. His hair was neatly combed, but not styled like the businessmen and executives who usually filled these halls. He carried no briefcase, no badge on a lanyard, nothing to suggest he had legitimate business being here after hours. And yet, the way he walked, calm, deliberate, almost rehearsed, made me hesitate. It was as though he was daring me to question him. My first instinct was to wave him through, to avoid confrontation altogether. After all, I was just a security guard, paid to follow procedures, but never to make waves. Most nights I preferred silence to conflict, and the thought of challenging someone who seemed so sure of himself filled me with a creeping unease. What if I was wrong? What if he belonged here, and stopping him would only embarrass me? My paycheck barely kept me afloat as it was. I couldn't afford to lose this job over a mistake. But then again, what if I was right? What if letting him pass meant failing at the one responsibility I actually had? I watched him approach, his footsteps steady on the marble floor, the faint echo filling the quiet lobby. My hand hovered near the logbook on the desk, the pen ready, my body tense as though preparing for a fight that might never happen. He didn't look at me right away. His gaze was fixed ahead, as though I wasn't even worth noticing, and that, more than anything, set my nerves on edge. People who belonged in this building always acknowledged me with at least a nod, even if out of habit. This man gave me nothing, no recognition, no respect, just the steady march of someone who intended to go wherever he pleased. I stepped out from behind the desk, my heart racing though my face remained neutral. "Excuse me, sir," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. "The building is closed after hours. Can I see some identification?" For the first time, he stopped, his head turning slowly toward me. His eyes met mine, and in that single glance, I felt as though he had stripped me bare. There was no panic in his gaze, no guilt, no nervous fumbling like I expected. Instead, there was calm amusement, as though he found my attempt to stop him interesting, even entertaining. My throat went dry, but I forced myself not to look away. "Identification?" he repeated, his voice low, steady, carrying a weight that made the hair on my arms stand up. He slipped one hand into his jacket pocket, not hurriedly, not carelessly, but with the controlled motion of someone who had nothing to fear. My instincts screamed louder, telling me that I wasn't dealing with an ordinary late-night visitor. Behind me, the cameras blinked silently, recording everything. For a split second, I wondered how it would look later. Me standing in the way of a man who exuded quiet authority, demanding proof he had no obligation to give. My mind wrestled between fear and duty, between the temptation to step aside and the responsibility drilled into me with every shift. The rule was clear. No badge, no entry. But rules were easy when the people you enforced them on didn't look like this man. He pulled his hand out of his jacket, and for an instant my heart thudded painfully, irrational fear imagining the worst. But instead of a weapon, he held out an empty palm, a half-smile curving his lips. "What makes you think I don't belong here?" he asked casually, his voice carrying an edge that was more challenge than question. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the clipboard in my hand. "Procedure," I said firmly, though inside my nerves rattled. "No one gets through without proper identification after hours." His eyes lingered on me, sharp, unblinking, the kind of look that makes you question everything you know about yourself. He took a slow step closer, and though his movements were calm, each step felt like a test, pressing me to see if I would back down. I didn't. My legs felt heavy, but I stayed planted where I was, barring his way. "You're new here?" he asked softly, tilting his head slightly, studying me as though I were the intruder. "Not new," I replied, forcing strength into my voice. "Just doing my job." For a moment, silence stretched between us, the air thick with tension. The hum of the vending machine in the corner suddenly sounded deafening. My heart hammered. Sweat pricked at the back of my neck, but I didn't move. I couldn't. Every instinct told me this was more than a routine encounter, that this man was more than he appeared, and if I let him pass, I'd regret it forever. Finally, he chuckled. Low, controlled, but unmistakably amused. "Most guards wouldn't have stopped me," he said, almost to himself. "Most wouldn't have dared." His tone carried a strange mixture of mockery and respect, as though my insistence both irritated and impressed him. I didn't know what to say, so I stood my ground, clipboard pressed against my chest like a shield. He reached into his jacket again, and this time pulled out a thin leather wallet. My pulse spiked as he flipped it open with deliberate calm. What I saw inside made the blood drain from my face. The card wasn't the usual employee ID I had been expecting. It carried a name, a title, and a seal that made my knees threaten to buckle. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had no idea who I had just stopped at the gate. He looked at me like I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. His eyes, sharp and unblinking, bore into mine with an intensity that made the air between us feel heavy. It was the kind of look that strips you down to nothing, the kind of look that tells you without words that you have crossed a line you never should have approached. And yet, I held my ground, clipboard pressed against my chest like armor, trying desperately to remember why I had stopped him in the first place. For a moment, he said nothing. He just stood there, his lips slightly curved, not in a smile but in something far more unsettling, an expression that hovered between amusement and contempt. It was as though he was giving me a chance to back down, to step aside and pretend this confrontation had never happened. His silence was a challenge, daring me to either fold or double down. "Sir," I said again, my voice firmer than I felt. "I need to see identification. This building is closed to unauthorized visitors after hours." His jaw tightened ever so slightly, and for the first time, he spoke with more weight than before. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his tone calm but laced with authority, the kind of authority that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. The question rattled me more than I cared to admit. My instinct was to say yes, though the truth was I had no idea. My training told me not to care who someone was. Procedure was procedure, but something about the way he asked it made me second-guess everything. Still, I clung to the rules, because they were all I had. Without them, I was just a man in a cheap uniform pretending to matter. "I don't, sir," I admitted, keeping my voice steady. "And that's why I need to see your ID." His eyes narrowed, and his composure cracked just slightly. A low chuckle escaped him, but it wasn't warm. It was edged with disbelief. "Most people don't question me," he said, his voice carrying a quiet dominance. "They see me, and they step aside." "Most people aren't doing their jobs," I replied before I could stop myself. The words left my mouth too quickly, too firmly, and the second they did, I felt a wave of regret crash over me. His eyes flickered, sharp and assessing, as though filing away every syllable for later judgment. The tension between us thickened. He stepped closer, not aggressively, but with enough presence that I had to force myself not to flinch. His plain clothing might have suggested simplicity, but his aura betrayed something much greater. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that only came from power, from years of people bending to his will, from knowing that his presence alone commanded obedience. Even dressed in jeans and sneakers, he radiated authority, and standing in front of him, I felt small, yet stubbornly unwilling to step aside. "Do you realize what you're doing?" he asked quietly, almost conversationally, though the weight in his tone made it feel like a warning. "You're making this much harder for yourself than it needs to be." I swallowed hard, the back of my neck prickling with sweat, but I didn't move. "All I'm doing," I said, "is my job. I can't let anyone through without proper identification, no matter who they are." His expression hardened, and for a moment I thought he might snap. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes glinting with frustration. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning above us. Every second felt like a rope tightening around my chest. It was then that I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. Two of my colleagues had drifted closer, drawn by the unusual standoff in the lobby. They didn't intervene, didn't offer help, just lingered nearby, whispering to each other, their eyes flicking between me and the stranger. Their hushed voices carried enough for me to catch fragments. "He's going too far. Why doesn't he just let the guy through? This is going to end badly." Their words burned hotter than the man's stare. Shame and doubt twisted in my gut. Was I making a fool of myself? Was I risking my job for nothing? I could feel their judgment like needles against my back, their smirks waiting for me to collapse under the weight of my own stubbornness. And yet, despite it all, I couldn't bring myself to step aside. Not now. Not when the rules were the only shield I had to prove I mattered. The man's gaze flicked briefly toward my colleagues, then back to me. His frustration deepened, but there was something else there now too. Curiosity. It was as though he was studying me, dissecting my resolve, deciding whether I was a fool or something more. "Most guards," he said finally, his voice measured, "would have let me pass without a word. You're either very brave or very stupid." "Maybe both," I answered quietly, though the tremor in my voice betrayed how much I was shaking inside. For the first time, he smiled, a small, sharp smile that didn't reach his eyes. He reached into his jacket again, slowly, deliberately, his movements controlled enough to make me tense all over again. My colleagues leaned in, their whispers rising, their curiosity sharpening. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched his hand disappear into his pocket, every muscle in my body screaming at me to prepare for anything. And then, with a calmness that unsettled me even more than anger would have, he pulled out a sleek leather wallet. With a flick of his wrist, he opened it, revealing a card inside. The color drained from my face the moment I saw it. It wasn't the kind of ID I had expected. This wasn't just an employee badge or a visitor pass. It was something far heavier, carrying a name, a title, and a seal that made my knees threaten to give way beneath me. In that instant, everything I thought I knew about the man in front of me shattered. Then, his ID revealed something that made my heart sink. The man I had stopped wasn't just anyone, he was the CEO himself. The letters on the card burned into my eyes, as though they had been written in fire. His name, bold and undeniable, sat just above the company seal, and beneath it the words that made my stomach drop. Chief Executive Officer. My breath caught in my throat, my hands trembled against the clipboard, and for a moment I thought my knees might buckle beneath me. I had spent years guarding doors, memorizing procedures, and dealing with ordinary employees who walked in and out of this building. And on this night, of all nights, I had chosen to stop the one man who owned it all. The silence that followed was suffocating. My colleagues, who had been whispering at a distance, finally realized the weight of the confrontation. One of them audibly gasped, the sound sharp in the quiet lobby. Another let out a soft, disbelieving laugh that quickly turned into nervous chuckling, as though he couldn't decide whether to find this amusing or terrifying. Their whispers grew louder, circling around me like vultures. He stopped the CEO. He's finished. Does he even know what he's done? Each word hit me like a slap, and my chest tightened with humiliation. Heat rose in my face, not from anger but from the crushing realization of how foolish I must have looked, demanding identification from the very man who signed our paychecks. My mind spun wildly, grasping at possibilities, at excuses, at any way to salvage what I had just done. But no matter how I twisted it in my head, there was no escaping the truth. I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The CEO said nothing at first. He simply held my gaze, his eyes cold and sharp, studying me with unnerving precision. His expression was unreadable, but his silence was louder than any reprimand could have been. I felt exposed, like a child who had been caught stealing, waiting for the punishment that was sure to follow. Every second stretched endlessly, the tension suffocating, until I could barely hear my own breathing. I wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain that I had only been doing my job, that I hadn't known, that I never meant disrespect. But my throat tightened, my words stuck like stones, and all I could do was stand there, frozen under the weight of his gaze. Meanwhile, my colleagues were not silent. One of them smirked openly, clearly savoring my impending downfall. Another shook his head in disbelief, whispering to the receptionist, who now stared wide-eyed at the scene unfolding before her. Their reactions cut deeper than I expected, because in their eyes, I wasn't just a guard anymore. I was the fool who had dared to challenge the king. My mind spiraled. Further, faster, chasing the consequences that awaited me. Would I be fired on the spot? Would I be blacklisted from the company, my reputation ruined, leaving me with nothing but regret? I pictured myself returning home to my parents, telling them I had lost my job, watching the disappointment cloud their already weary faces. I imagined the endless hunt for another position, the rejection letters piling up, the weight of failure pressing me into the ground. In the blink of an eye, I saw my fragile stability collapse like a house of cards. And still, the CEO remained silent. He slid his wallet back into his jacket pocket with deliberate calm, his movements slow, precise, almost theatrical in their weight. His eyes never left mine, and it was as though he could see every thought racing through my head, every fear unraveling me from the inside out. I had faced angry employees before, even entitled managers who barked orders as though guards were disposable furniture. But this was different. His silence wasn't dismissal. It was judgment, heavy and calculated. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, and laced with an authority that made the air feel heavier. "Do you know what this means?" he asked, not raising his voice, but speaking with the kind of calm that made my heart hammer even harder. I swallowed hard, struggling to find words. "Sir, I didn't know. I was just following protocol," I stammered, my voice shaking despite my effort to remain steady. His lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze still piercing through me. "Protocol," he repeated slowly, as though tasting the word, weighing its worth. "You think protocol excuses you from consequences?" I froze, unable to answer, because I didn't know. Protocol was supposed to protect me, to justify my actions, but under his gaze it felt flimsy, fragile, like a paper shield in a storm. My colleagues shifted behind me, their whispers growing bolder now that they knew the truth. "He's gone. He's finished." Their words stung, feeding the panic clawing at my chest. I wanted to turn and tell them to shut up, to stop enjoying my humiliation, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the CEO. His presence pinned me in place, immovable, like prey caught in the stare of a predator. Every instinct told me to apologize, to beg, to throw myself at his mercy. But another part of me, smaller, quieter, yet stubborn, whispered that I had only done my job, that I had followed the rules exactly as I had been told. I clung to that thought desperately, like a drowning man clutching driftwood. The CEO took a step closer, and though his movements were slow, they carried an undeniable force. He was taller than I had realized, his frame imposing even in plain clothes. He didn't need a suit or a title on display. His authority radiated naturally, filling the space and swallowing me whole. His eyes remained locked on mine, sharp and unyielding, and I felt my stomach twist into knots under the weight of it. The lobby seemed to shrink around us. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably. My colleagues watched eagerly, and I stood frozen, each second dragging out like an eternity. The humiliation pressed harder, my fear growing heavier, until I wanted to sink into the floor and vanish altogether. And then, just as I braced myself for the inevitable words, dismissal, termination, ruin, he spoke again. His voice was quieter this time, but no less commanding, cutting through the silence with unnerving clarity. But instead of firing me on the spot, he said, his sharp eyes never leaving mine, he said something unexpected. Instead of punishment, he turned the moment into a test of character. I had braced myself for the blow, for the order to pack my things, for the humiliation of being marched out of the building, for the whispers of my colleagues turning into triumphant laughter at my downfall. Yet none of that came. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten me, didn't call for my supervisor to deliver judgment. Instead, he studied me with unnerving calm, as though I were not a guard who had disrespected him, but a puzzle he was determined to solve. His silence weighed on me heavier than anger ever could. His eyes locked on mine, sharp and searching, peeling away the thin shield of confidence I had left. I shifted slightly, the clipboard slick in my sweaty palms, but I refused to lower my gaze. Even in that moment of dread, something inside me whispered that surrendering too quickly would only make me smaller. Finally, he broke the silence. His voice was calm, measured, almost casual, but it carried the unmistakable gravity of someone used to commanding attention. "Tell me," he said slowly, his words deliberate. "Why did you stop me?" The question caught me off guard. My breath hitched, and for a moment I thought he was mocking me, but the seriousness in his eyes told me otherwise. He wanted an answer. Not an excuse, not an apology, but the truth. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Because it's my job, sir," I said carefully, my voice trembling despite my effort to keep it steady. "I'm responsible for this building after hours. No identification, no entry. That's the rule." He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing, as if weighing every syllable. A flicker of something, amusement, maybe curiosity, passed across his face, and the corner of his mouth lifted in the faintest smirk. "So you would risk your job to uphold a rule?" The question sank into me like a blade. I wanted to say no, that of course I wouldn't risk everything over something so small, but deep inside I knew the truth was yes. Without those rules, without that structure, I was nothing more than a man in a cheap uniform. The rules gave me dignity, gave me purpose, gave me something solid to cling to in a world that otherwise ignored me. "Yes," I said finally, forcing the word out through the knot in my chest. "Because if I don't follow the rules, Then I don't belong here at all. For a moment, he said nothing, and the silence stretched so long that my own words began to echo in my head, each one heavier than the last. His eyes remained fixed on me, unblinking, as though trying to determine whether I truly believed what I had just said. My pulse pounded in my ears, my chest tight with the weight of his judgment. Then he leaned back slightly, slipping his hands into his jacket pockets with a relaxed air that contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. His smirk widened just a fraction, not enough to be warm, but enough to suggest something deeper was at play. "Interesting," he murmured, almost to himself. The sound of nervous laughter drifted from behind me. My colleagues, still hovering near the edge of the lobby, whispered among themselves, their voices carrying hints of disbelief. "He's actually arguing with him," one said. "Does he not know who he's talking to?" The words stung, but I forced myself to ignore them. My focus had to remain on the man in front of me, the man who held my future in his hands. "Do you know what happens?" the CEO continued, his voice low and calm. "When someone challenges authority at the wrong time, in the wrong way?" I swallowed hard, resisting the urge to look away. "They face the consequences," I admitted, my voice quieter now, nearly a whisper. He nodded slowly, as though confirming a lesson he had already known but wanted me to say aloud. "And yet, here you are, standing your ground." His gaze lingered, piercing and unrelenting. "Is it fearlessness? Or foolishness?" I had no answer. My chest ached with the weight of the question, and my mind scrambled for words that would make sense of the mess I was in. But the truth was simple. I hadn't thought about the consequences when I stopped him. I had only thought about doing what was expected of me, what I had sworn to uphold every time I walked into this building in uniform. "It's not fearlessness," I said finally, my voice steadier now. "And maybe it is foolishness. But rules matter, sir. They're all I have." His smirk lingered, but there was something new in his eyes now. A glint of respect, faint but unmistakable. He studied me for another long moment, then nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly. The tension in my chest eased just enough for me to take a shaky breath, though the fear still coiled deep inside me. My colleagues continued to whisper, their faces a mixture of pity, amusement, and awe. The receptionist, who had been silent all this time, now leaned forward slightly, her eyes wide with curiosity. The entire lobby seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the CEO's final judgment. The seconds dragged on endlessly, each one heavier than the last. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, the pounding of my pulse against my temples. My future hung suspended in the air, balanced on the edge of his next words. Would he see my insistence as dedication or defiance? Would he respect my honesty, or would he crush me for daring to stand in his way? When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost unnervingly so, but every syllable carried weight. "You're either exactly the kind of person I want in this building, or exactly the kind of person I don't." The words struck me like lightning, leaving me stunned, breathless, unsure whether they were praise or condemnation. My heart sank even as a sliver of hope flickered faintly inside me. For the first time that night, I realized I was not dealing with anger or dismissal. I was being measured, weighed, tested. And his next words made me doubt everything I thought I knew. What started as a confrontation became a life-changing dialogue. I had braced myself for fury, for dismissal, for the kind of verbal blow that would strip me of the little dignity I had left. Instead, he did something I could never have predicted. He asked me to sit. His tone was steady, his face unreadable, but there was a strange calmness in his command, and before I realized what I was doing, I obeyed. I sat across from him at the small security desk in the corner of the lobby, my clipboard still in my hands, my heart pounding as though I were on trial. He leaned against the edge of the desk, arms crossed, his gaze never leaving mine. There was a sharpness in his eyes, but also something else, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, nor was it disappointment. It was curiosity. He studied me like a man examining a rare object, not sure whether it was worthless or priceless. "Tell me about yourself," he said suddenly, his voice calm, deliberate. The question caught me off guard. Of all the things I expected, this wasn't one of them. My mouth opened, but no words came. I was used to answering orders, not questions. Nobody ever asked me about myself, not really. Most people glanced past me as if I were part of the furniture. But he waited, silent and patient, his eyes fixed on me, and I realized he wasn't going to let me escape with a simple answer. "I'm just a guard, sir," I began, my voice quiet, uncertain. His brow lifted slightly, as though he didn't accept that answer. "That's not what I asked," he said. "I asked about you, your life, your story." The weight of his words pressed against me. My story? What was my story? For so long I had buried it beneath silence and routine, convinced nobody cared to hear it. But something about the way he asked, the way his gaze held mine, stripped away my excuses. Against my own instincts, I started to speak. I told him about my parents, about how my father's hands were permanently scarred by years of repairing engines for pennies, and how my mother's back ached from scrubbing floors in houses she would never afford to live in. I told him how I had dreamed of college, but traded those dreams for night shifts and bills, how I watched my friends leave for universities while I stood in a uniform, invisible to the world. I told him about the monotony of my job, the long hours staring at cameras, the silence that crept into my bones, the feeling that life was passing me by while I remained stuck in the shadows. The words spilled out more easily than I expected, and the more I spoke, the lighter I felt. His expression never wavered, though I thought I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes as I continued. Maybe he expected excuses, complaints, or flattery. Instead, all I had was honesty, and in that honesty, I felt both exposed and strangely liberated. When I finally stopped, the silence between us was different. It was not heavy or suffocating. It was reflective, almost thoughtful. He nodded slowly, as though digesting every word. "You know," he said finally, his voice softer now, "your story isn't so different from mine." I blinked at him, startled. "From yours?" The disbelief in my voice slipped out before I could stop it. He smirked faintly at my reaction, but there was no arrogance in it. "You think I was born into this suit, this title, this company?" he asked. "I wasn't. I grew up in a neighborhood where opportunity was a stranger, where every door seemed locked and every path was blocked. I worked nights in kitchens, hauling garbage, scrubbing floors. I know what it's like to be invisible, to be underestimated, to be told you'll never amount to anything." His words struck me like a hammer. I had always assumed men like him were born into power, raised in luxury, handed opportunities I could only dream of. To hear that he had once stood where I stood, tired, dismissed, hungry for something better, shook me to my core. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as though testing my reaction. "The difference between people who stay in those places and people who rise above them," he said slowly, "is not luck, not even talent. It's hunger. It's refusing to accept that where you are is all you'll ever be." I stared at him, my chest tight, my thoughts racing. Hunger. I knew hunger. Not just the kind that gnawed at your stomach when the fridge was empty, but the hunger for more. The hunger for meaning. The hunger to break free from the cage life had built around me. His words lit a spark inside me that I hadn't felt in years, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't doomed to remain in the shadows forever. For the first time that night, I didn't just see him as a CEO. I saw him as a man who had walked a road not so different from mine, a man who had faced his own battles, his own humiliations, and somehow risen above them. The distance between us seemed smaller, not in title or wealth, but in spirit. He studied me a moment longer, his smirk fading into something more serious. "You surprised me tonight," he admitted. "Most people would have stepped aside. Most people would have seen plain clothes and assumed I was just another man. But you didn't. You stood your ground, and then you told me the truth without hiding behind excuses. I didn't know what to say. My heart raced, my palms still damp with sweat, but beneath the nerves was a strange sense of pride. For the first time, I felt like maybe being honest, being stubborn, being me wasn't a weakness. Maybe it was the only thing that set me apart. The air between us shifted. It was no longer confrontation, no longer fear. It was something else entirely. Connection. Fragile, tentative, but real. I had stopped him as a stranger, but sitting there, listening to him share pieces of his own story, I felt as though the lines between our worlds had blurred. He was still the CEO, still a man whose power dwarfed mine. But for a brief moment, he was also just a man who understood. Then he leaned back, his arms crossing again, his eyes sharp but not unkind. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken thoughts, until finally he spoke words that sent a shiver down my spine. "Maybe," he said slowly. "You don't belong behind this desk, after all." My breath caught, my chest tightening with confusion, with hope, with fear. What did he mean? Where did I belong, if not here? The weight of his words pressed down on me, filling me with questions I couldn't answer. And then, with that same unsettling calm, he made an offer I never expected. "What if I told you this wasn't the end, but the beginning?" he asked. His words cut through the heavy silence of the lobby like a blade. I sat frozen, the weight of his question hanging in the air, too unreal to comprehend. For hours, I had been preparing myself for the end of my